everyone, and thank you for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the supply, commitment, and resource efficiency evaluation topics. I'm Christina Osborne, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be providing support for the meeting. For today's agenda, we will finish the discussion on the RUC design in EDAM, which will be led by George Angelides and James Friedrich from the ISO. And if time permits, Mark Richardson will continue to talk about failure consequences for RSE. At the end of the presentation, Bob Cott, who is described for this working group, will provide a recap of the discussion, and then Mark will go over the topics for the next meeting, which will be on Monday from 1 to 3. And we also have Phil Pattengill on the line, who is the coordinator of the EDAM working group. Just a couple of reminders, these working group meetings are intended to be collaborative. We do encourage you to ask questions and share your perspectives. So if at any time you do have a question, you can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you're going to want to press pound 2 on your phone, and then Mark Richardson will call on you when he sees you in the queue. Once your line is unmuted, just a reminder to start by stating your name and affiliation. These meetings are recorded, and we post video files out on the corresponding working group web pages, where you'll find the other materials related to these meetings. The recordings and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you have any follow-up questions after this meeting, please submit through the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. You're also welcome to reach out to us directly via email. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to Mark Richardson to go over the meeting objectives.
All right, can you hear me okay, Christina?
I can hear you.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, team. I appreciate everyone taking the time today. As Christina mentioned, we will start where we left off, which was at the end of the RUC presentation that George provided this past Monday. George's presentation covered the market processee timeline and an overview of how the ISO envisions the role for both RUC and convergence bidding in EDAM. The goal here is to see if there were any further thoughts or comments prior to diving into James's examples on RUC transfers. I had asked the group prior to ending the call in the last meeting whether or not entities shared the same view generally as the ISO in regards to agreeing that conceptually EDAM should have some form of RUC and or convergence bidding included in its design. Please note I will be posing this question and opening up to the audience at the end of James's presentation today, so please be prepared for that discussion. If time permits, I would also like to get back to our RSE failure consequences discussion we had previously started, but we will play that by ear based on time. Another important item to note for the audience is that based on stakeholder feedback, this working group will be posting a few questions by the end of this week for stakeholders to opine on. These questions are intended to provide the ISO policy team with the different perspectives on the topics and elements discussed to date and potentially help formulate the straw proposal. If time allows, we may discuss some of those responses in the coming weeks in this form. Christina, if you would kindly go to the next slide to help get the conversation started. George, if you don't mind taking it from here and provide a brief overview of why RUC is needed, and then move into the next slide that kind of tees up a few questions and answers supporting that need for RUC. At that point, I'm going to pause, and then let's get some questions and thoughts from the audience. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Mark. This is George Angelides with the ISO. So picking up these last 2 slides from the last presentation, just to connect here and carry on. So we wanted to provide an answer to the questions that we will be getting, why is RUC needed in EDAM? And we presented 3 reasons here. Essentially, you need RUC to cover the difference between your load schedule, which reflects the bids, the load bids that cleared in IFM, and the demand forecast. So reliability capacity that is procured in RUC makes up for the difference. And also because you may have virtual supply and demand schedules that cleared in IFM, but they're not real energy. These are simply financial positions in the day-ahead market, and they're liquidated in the Western energy balance market. And therefore, RUC is going to essentially substitute for any net virtual supply that clear the IFM, it will substitute it with physical supply so that you go into real time with all the capacity that is reserved from the day ahead and made available in real time to meet your demand forecast. And then as an added benefit here, we mentioned that RAC has a longer time horizon than IFM. It's usually executed for 48 and sometimes 72 hours, looking way into the future for D+1 and D+2. So with the extra time horizon window here, the RAC has the ability to commit optimally, let's say, even extra long start resources, which are resources that they take more than 18 hours to start. And obviously IFM with the shorter time horizon of 24 hours, it cannot do a good job at that. It's very difficult to evaluate the costs, the commitment cost of this long extra start resources. So we rely on RAC to do this job, and that's another added feature that RAC can provide. And then specific for EDAM now, when we're bringing RAC as a multi-BA optimization here, where reliability capacity is procured for the entire market footprint, you have the ability to actually use any leftover capacity on transfers between EDAM BAAs in RAC to schedule reliability capacity transfers to have an efficient solution for procuring reliability capacity at least cost over the entire market footprint. And that's only the beginning. In the slides with the examples that James is going to present later on today, it will become evident that you also need this reliability capacity transfers to cancel and nullify impacts that you have on the EDAM BAAs because of the particulars in the IFM solution with respect to load bids being different than your demand forecast and the presence of virtual supply and demand bids. And that's useful in RAC because RAC can actually not only use any leftover capacity in the direction that a transfer is scheduled in IFM, but it can actually counter, if that is necessary, it can counter with a reliability capacity transfer in the opposite direction. So you have, if the transmission capacity is clearing IFM because of the impact of virtual bids or load bids, then RAC has the ability to provide a solution to that with potentially scheduling reliability capacity transfers in the counterflow direction. Let's move to the next slide, Mark, if we can. We also had several questions on how the residual unit commitment relates to the resource sufficiency evaluation, both in EDAM and later on in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So we wanted to field a little bit some questions here for discussion. Very specifically, the notion that the BAA may pass the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation, there might be an assumption here that if that happens, then maybe there's no need for RAC, since you have passed the sufficiency evaluation. That means the BAA is sufficient in meeting its own requirements. Why do you need RAC then? And the answer is you do need RAC because you have to procure in the day-ahead market the reliability capacity so that it will be made available in EIM. Because that capacity, along with all capacity products that are procured in the day-ahead market, carries a real-time must-offer obligation, which means that the resource that has the award must cover that award with actual energy bids submitted in the real-time market so that this award can actually be dispatched. So you have this capacity that is set aside in the day-ahead market, and it will be available in real-time with bids to dispatch it. If you don't have RAC in place, any leftover capacity from the FM that didn't get an award, it doesn't have any obligation to be for you in real time. It may not be available. the worst thing that can happen, it may have not been committed, because RAC has the ability to commit extra resources that were not committed in IFM, simply didn't clear the IFM for economic displacement issues or what have you. But RAC, if it sees that these resources are needed and or are economic to meet real-time conditions as they're reflected in RAC, then RAC will actually commit these resources, and then these resources will be available to provide these services in real time. Long-start resources, if they're not committed in the day-ahead market, then they're not available in real time, because real time has a short time horizon, so it cannot commit long-start resources. So that's one benefit that you get with RAC. So how can RAC fail if you pass the EDAM RSC? And what we mean by RAC failure, we mean that there's no feasible solution in RAC. RAC could not procure all the amount of reliability capacity that was required. Most likely scenario is because there was not sufficient supply of reliability capacity bids, or transfers and/or transfers that lead into that BAA. They were either exhausted capacity-wise in IFM, and there's no additional capacity, or there was not sufficient additional capacity, leftover capacity that could be used by RAC in transfer. So the combination of those two may lead to the situation where RAC has to relax the power balance constraint in a BAA, which means that you're going short now in real time because the RAC did not have the ability to procure all the required capacity in the form of reliability capacity awards. So you'll have to make up that capacity shortfall between day ahead and real time so that you can pass the real time RSC in the EIM. And that's another reason why RAC is important, because if you have the necessary reliability capacity available in RAC to procure reliability capacity awards, then essentially you're going to EIM, secure that you have this capacity available, and that's the best possible scenario for being positioned to pass the EIM RSC. So let's see what else is in here. Yes, there was a question whether passing the EDAM RSC, maybe you can still lean on other BAAs in RAC, and the answer is yes, and that's the purpose of the reliability capacity transfers. The purpose is not to lean, of course, but to provide economic displacement. So if you have sufficient reliability capacity bids so that you can meet your own needs without any help from other BAAs through the transfer, that's of course what we want to see. But then when RAC runs, it actually can use reliability capacity transfers for economic displacement to get to a more efficient solution. But how can we secure that there are enough reliability capacity bids in the market for a given BAA? Can we test for that in the EDAM RSC? And the answer is not, unfortunately, because we don't know what the reliability capacity requirement is. We have to run the IFM first to see how short the load schedule that clears the IFM is from the demand forecast, and what kind of virtual supply, net virtual supply has cleared the IFM to figure out what the requirement is for reliability capacity. So we can't test for this in advance. So naturally, the next question that comes up is, okay, so we cannot test it, how can we prevent it? And the recommendation that I made last time, and you can see it here, is of course to make all the capacity that you put in IFM with a bid for one commodity or another, you commit that capacity to participate in IFM, make all that capacity to RAC as well with reliability capacity bids. Since you are bidding that capacity in IFM, you're making it available in IFM, potentially you will get schedules for awards, so you're essentially committing that capacity to be available also in real time because of the must offer obligation for all the capacity services awarded in IFM. So therefore, what I said last time was that it doesn't hurt you to make this available in rack. If any of that capacity is not scheduled in IFM, rack can consider it, and that is how you can secure that you won't lean on other BAAs in rack, and you will have the best possible scenario for meeting your requirements and going to real time in EIM with the best possible position to pass the EIM RSC. And at the same time, also, you have the ability to get some revenue stream for the capacity availability, because when reliability capacity awards clear the market, there is also a calculation that comes up with a locational reliability capacity marginal price, which is used for the settlement of reliability capacity in the day-ahead market. So that's an extra revenue stream. So I'm going to pause here. We recapped based on what we said last time at the end of the presentation, and we really want to open all these questions up for discussion. And Mark, back to you.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that recap of those previous two slides. I know on Monday we left 3 hands up, and it was Lindsay's, I believe it was Carrie's, and then I missed the third individual. But prior to having James walk through the examples that kind of help illustrate what RUC and convergence bidding looks like within EDAM and RSC, I do want to pause here and get some feedback. Does the audience have any questions, concerns, or comments regarding what's been covered on RUC and convergence bidding to this point?
As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question.
All right. And sorry, it looks like I cut out a little bit at the end there. I do see Jeff Spires with his hand up. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Operator, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Jeff's line.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. I just wanted to provide some higher level thoughts about RUC and about the EDAM design more generally. I think in today's world within the CAISO markets, CAISO relies on the RUC as well as other out-of-market actions extensively because of the fact that currently the IFM is not securing all of the products that are really necessary to meet the needs of the grid. And that's, of course, why the DAM-E initiative has been going on for the past several years and seeking solutions to address that. I think from an EDAM point of view, I am somewhat concerned about developing a proposal that so heavily emphasizes the use of RUC within the design. It indicates to me that the design is perhaps being informed by some of the issues that the CAISO is currently grappling with, and that those types of issues could end up being extended to EDAM if the result is an over-reliance on RUC to commit resources in other BAs beyond just the CAISO, or to create EDAM transactions and transfers that are not being cleared through the market, but instead being arranged after the fact through the RUC process. So I think in principle, the EDAM design development should be focused on minimizing those sequential steps of procuring supply, not only through IFM, but potentially through RUC or other out-of-market actions after that. I think instead we should be striving to the maximum extent possible to develop a single co-optimized solution through the IFM itself that would be committing enough supply to maintain reliability, but also doing that efficiently and setting appropriate prices that reflect the full needs of the grid. And I think there are a number of different elements that would go along with that concept. One is implementing an imbalance reserve product as being discussed in the DAME proposal and the DAME initiative. But the other is also, to the extent that virtuals are enabled in other BAs within EDAM, which I think is, at least in my mind, an open question, but to the extent that virtuals are enabled, considering then how to ensure that the IFM clears sufficient physical capacity to backstop those virtual bids through the market itself. So I just wanted to provide that feedback because I do think, in order to get an efficient outcome, to maintain reliability, to get the prices that reflect the true needs of the grid, we should be striving the best we can to minimize RUC or other out-of-market actions to address an IFM that doesn't clear all the necessary products.
Thank you for your comments, Jeff. And so I believe I understand your stance quite well, and you said something about, ensuring to the extent, and I agree that virtual bidding is an open question, and that's why it's in this form. If virtuals are in place, how does the group ensure the IFM is clearing enough capacity and energy? And I thought that was one of the benefits of RUC. And George, please weigh in and opine on Jeff's comments if you don't mind, or Danny Johnson from the ISO if you have some comments. But and maybe I'm just misunderstanding one of the benefits of RUC, but I'll turn it over to George at this point.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I think, Jeff, you're referring to an older day-ahead market enhancements proposal where we were contemplating having a single solution between FM and RUC instead of having them as separate passes, having them as one single co-optimization step. Am I right? Did I get this right? Is this your reference?
Thanks, George. In a sense, yes. I think some of the previous iterations of the DAME proposal in past versions had proposed something that we thought was a good solution to trying to deal with virtuals, deal with imbalance reserves, and bring in a physical capacity constraint into the IFM so that that single market run would support virtual transactions, as well as, though, ensuring that the total physical supply that cleared through the market was sufficient to meet the needs of the grid from a reliability perspective, and that it would do that on a co-optimized basis. Not to say that that's necessarily the only solution. I think what I was really trying to get to was that from an objectives point of view, I think that striving to minimize RUC or other sequential steps that happen after the IFM is what we should be trying to achieve. And that's why I wanted to raise that. But whether that previous DAME solution is one approach or if there are other alternatives to that, I think there certainly could be. But it was more just from what we think we should be trying to achieve that I was making that comment.
I see. Well, yeah, well, I don't know, Jeff, how I can answer this. I mean, we did, as you said, contemplated this as a potential option when we were discussing it in the context of the DAME initiative. Let's see, must be more than a year and a half ago. And we looked at all the pros and cons, and we took a decision at that time that this was not the proper way to move forward in the day-ahead market enhancement. So it's in a rear-view mirror now in this initiative. I don't think now in EDAM we have to look back, and I don't know how constructive will be to reopen those old discussions that we really concluded back then. So I don't know what is your intent here. I mean, we cannot afford to restart that process that took a year in debating, and I believe that we closed on that issue. That doesn't mean that we are not going to look at it again in the future if situations change. However, I don't think it's in the scope of EDAM at this point to restructure fundamentally the day-ahead market from what is in the day-ahead market enhancements proposal that took years in the making to get some consensus in that particular initiative. So don't you think?
Thanks, George, for that. I mean, just a couple things, and then I'll turn it over to others. I think, maybe we have a different perspective on how, where we arrived at that from a day-ahead market enhancements point of view. But my recollection was that the CAISO ultimately decided not to move forward with that, particularly in the context of the CAISO VA and trying to move forward with something that would address the needs specific to the CAISO at that point in time. But I think there was also a broader recognition that once we start looking at EDAM and multiple VAs that could be participating in the market and seeking a design solution that meets the objectives of securing enough physical supply and doing it in an efficient way, that some of these ideas would be brought forward in this context. So I think that's really where I'm coming from in mentioning that previous proposal, is what makes sense in the context of EDAM. But as I mentioned before as well, I was really just trying to get at the fundamental principle that finding a co-optimized solution that is minimizing those sequential or out-of-market steps is, at least in our view, an ideal. It may not be possible to completely minimize out-of-market actions, for example, or other steps from time to time, but I think as a principle, trying to find a design that secures the necessary products through the market itself, it should be the objective.
Thanks, Jeff, for your comments. I definitely I made a note here, and I think the ISO team understands your perspective. Let me go to Lindsay from NV.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Lindsay Schweckoy with NV Energy. I just had a quick question. I'm sorry if I missed this, but I was wondering what forecast is used for the resource efficiency test, or is that the same forecast that is also used for RUC?
Yes, it's the same demand forecast that we said we're going to freeze it at 9 a.m. so that we make the responses, if any are needed, in passing the RSC test easy, so that you don't have to put a moving target. So yeah, it's the same demand forecast that is used in RSC. The same one will be used in RUC.
Okay, that answers that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. All right, let's go to Connie's line. And Connie, if you wouldn't mind announcing who you're with.
Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
My name's Connie Wiestat, and I'm with the Nevada Commission. We have a question about the derivation of this RUC power, whether it's a resource efficiency issue or a resource adequacy issue, and what the state commission's role is in terms of reviewing and approving these sorts of things, since that's a state issue, not a market issue.
Let me see I don't know if we have Melos on the line, if he'd like to, or Danny. I see Danny Johnson raised his hand. Let's go to Danny Johnson at the ISO, please, to respond to Connie's comment and question.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Mark. This is Danny Johnson with the ISO. So, Connie, I don't think this is so much an IRP or RA issue. Getting back to what Lindsay's question is, the RSC would be testing forecasts that would be used in RUC. So the RSC is just looking to determine if each BAA would be able to meet their forecasted demand during the next day.
How are these resources designated, though, and by whom?
So is this going back to kind of the OAT framework of the designated network resources and NITs?
No, it's where who is making a determination of what these resources are. We just don't understand where they come from and how I guess how bids are made relative to them.
So you're asking how would the resources within each BAA participate in the market through bidding?
No, through RUC. We don't know what RUC is, and how those resources are designated as RUC. Who does that?
So I think the bullet that George is trying to highlight at the end, that the easiest way to do this would just be all capacity bid into the IFM would be converted to also having a RUC capacity bid would be the easiest way to do it. So any resource made available to the IFM for optimal use would also be available to the RUC process to make that the outcome of the combined EDAM, IFM, and RUC is a reliable, efficient solution.
But that doesn't get to the question of how are these resources determined as being unit contingent resources? Who makes that determination? The CISO?
I would defer to somebody else at the ISO. I'm not following the question that you're getting at. So maybe somebody else might be following it better on our team.
This is what is it a function of resource adequacy coming out of the California PUC, or is it simply an ISO product?
Let me try to chime in here, and hopefully I can help. This is George Angelovis with the ISO. So it is a capacity product, and it's one of the commodities that the day-ahead market procures today, and we're extending this in EDAM to other EDAM BAAs. It is not directly related with the array capacity for ISO resources. However, there is currently a must-offer requirement for most array resources in the ISO BAA to participate in RAC, same as they are required to participate in IFM because they have the requirement of serve load. But other than that, there is no direct relationship. It's just one of the commodities that the day-ahead market procures.
But it's the derivation.
So any resource can bid.
I'm sorry.
Any resource can bid. Yeah, they don't have to be array. Any resource can bid for the service and can be awarded for that service.
And then that makes it a non-RA resource?
It could be either array or non-array.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Go ahead, Phil.
I'm sorry.
I
interrupted.
Maybe I can help here, Connie. This is Phil Pattengill from the ISO. If I understand your question, you're trying to tie the RUC capacity back to resource adequacy. And I think George started to touch on it, but I think we can be even more explicit about it. There is no connection to resource adequacy in regards to the capacity that would be offered into RUC. It can be any resource that's being offered. And what we're simply trying to show here is that those capacity bids that are coming into RUC will be used to fill this deficiency that we're identifying as part of the RUC process. Now, the only connection to RA for California, as you've raised, is what the RUC bid price might be. But in terms of the capacity itself, there is no restrictions. And what we're suggesting, and George has just said, is why not offer all the capacity that was offered up in the RSE test? But that doesn't mean that an entity couldn't offer more. So there isn't a connection to RA. It's a matter of making the capacity available so the RUC process can identify and potentially clear additional capacity that didn't come out of the IFM. Is that helpful?
It is. It still doesn't answer my question, and maybe I'm simply not capable of understanding. I don't know how this designation is made. So how does something become RUC?
Well, it becomes RUC because it clears RUC. RUC determines it's needed and based on its bid price. but it sounds like your question is more along the lines of what capacity is being offered. And what we're simply saying is it can be any capacity is being offered. But in the context of the RSC, we're recommending why wouldn't an EDAM entity offer all of the capacity that's made available in the RSC, also attach RUC capacity bids and allow it to then participate in RUC and provide the economic benefits and reliability benefits there.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate you taking my question.
Sure, great, thank you. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, George and Danny. All right, let's go to Dan Williams at Customized Energy Solutions.
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, thanks, Mark. A number of questions, but I'll try to throw them out there succinctly. First, just kind of a clarifying one on the response back to Lindsay at NV Energy, and that's just for the forecast that's used, the demand forecast that's used in the RSC. Would that be a high confidence forecast that we currently see in RUC, or would we be back to using sort of a standard CAISO forecasted demand for the RSC requirement? And then kind of second to that, if it is a high confidence forecast or an adjusted forecast, or if that would still be an outcome that could happen in RUC, sorry, if there would still be the opportunity for operators to adjust the forecast in RUC, would there be an expectation that that could somehow get reflected in the RSC requirement in the morning? Or would that also be an opportunity for EDAM BAs to adjust and do the same thing? And I'm just trying to get at the potential for disconnects between the sort of procurement target that's set by the RSC and the procurement target that may end up being set by RUC later in the day.
Is there someone from the ISO that would like to take Dan's question? Thank you for the question, Dan. If so, please unmute your line. James, you want to take a swing at that?
Sure. Hey, Dan. Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so this it's a good question, and it kind of gets back a little bit, ties back a little bit today at market enhancements. Our impression is that by implementing the imbalance reserve product, the CAISO operators would remove at least the systematic need for manual RUC adjustments. And you're referring to the high confidence load forecast, which is the basis that operators are using today to determine how the quantity that they adjust the RUC upward. But as we've described in the DAME initiative, that RUC adjustments today, although for the most part are made because of the lack of an uncertainty product in the IFM, there are also some other subtler reasons that RUC adjustments can occur related to sort of one-off reliability risks or other things that are seen by the operators. And so how that translates into EDAM, I think that's something that stakeholders need to discuss, what the future of RUC adjustments in EDAM are. So I'll kind of leave it there.
Okay, so a potential that you still have to kind of sort out if there were kind of other reasons that a RUC adjustment might be needed from a EDAM BA operator. You might have to figure out how to do that. The second question I had is kind of more big picture market perspective, and that's just whether thinking about the market today or in the future, how does the CAISO see sort of the presence of RUC in the market influencing the way that prices form in the IFM and the price signals that are sent to demand in the IFM? And just thinking about, we had this issue identified back in August, September 2020, and maybe to some extent last year of demand bidding below CAISO's forecast, and that kind of creating a larger gap for RUC to have to deal with. And so the question kind of remains there for me of if we continue to sort of rely on RUC or make it more robust, are we kind of locking in a lack of price signal or direct price signal in the market to the way that the IFM is clearing, and kind of what are the consequences of that?
This is George Angelidis with the ISO. So this question goes back to, I think, what Jeff was discussing earlier. And right now, in the design that we have in front of us for DAME and EDAM, rack is a separate pass from the IFM, and it's actually in the sequence, it's run after IFM. So there's no real impact of the rack and the procurement of reliability capacity onto the IFM marginal prices. When we were looking, back in some initial phase of the DAME initiative, the possibility of merging IFM and rack into a single optimization problem, then at that, with that formulation, you had obviously an impact of the reliability capacity and those prices to the IFM commodities and their marginal prices, because they're all co-optimized in that particular formulation. And since this is the second time that I see this question coming up here, then I guess I'm going to spend a little bit more time to explain that among the many pros and cons that this formulation has.
George, before you go there, though, because I don't think we need to kind of rehash the other DAME solution. It's more just a question of, and maybe a statement of, saying that it feels like if we're going to go through the effort of redesigning markets, that we should be trying to do something that sends accurate price signals and that tries to get as much of the solution that we want out of the IFM. And I know that you're attempting to do that with imbalance reserves, but just looking at a lot of the work that's been done over the last couple of years in the price performance report and elsewhere, maybe to make sure that solution that comes out of the IFM can be as inclusive as possible of the appropriate clearing of supply and demand at a rational price. And it's just a persistent concern that having RUC, even if it's done well, still is an out of market solution to an extent that isn't influencing that price.
Yeah, and did I hear you correctly, Dan? And one of the concerns you brought up was the load potentially not necessarily bidding in their full forecasted amount and then allowing RUC to make up that difference.
Yeah, and it's a persistent concern that if RUC, and even with we haven't really gotten to discussing that with the imbalance reserve targets or the reliability capacity targets, that if through those two products the market's ending up consistently oversupplied between day ahead and real time on a regular basis, then that just leads to having less of an incentive for demand to try to meet all of its position in the IFM, just under the expectation that real time is going to consistently be priced lower than the day ahead market.
Gotcha. So great question, Dan, and I see Jeff Nelson with his hand up, and I'm hoping he wants to opine on this, because I do believe one of the common design principles is that, it's kind of that all or nothing stance with participating load. So, operator, if you
just one last thing on that, Mark, is that I know that ideally virtuals would converge that those two, or that whole situation, right? And that would be the goal, but just testing whether that's what's actually happening in the market today, and then on our way to discussing convergence bidding virtuals in the EDAM, to what extent we think that we should have confidence that would make up for those results in EDAM as well, or that all the pieces would come together the way that ideally you'd want them to.
Dan. Jeff?
Good afternoon. It's Jeff Nelson, SCE. I've heard a couple times people refer to RUC as out of market. It's not. RUC is a market. Now, yeah, it's outside of the energy optimization initially, but it's a full-blown market. It's producing nodal prices and clearing, and there's bidding going on. So it's not out of market. It's a full-on market. The other issue about virtuals and RUC and IFM price formation, those do go hand in hand. California, before we had virtual bidding, had, as I recall, a sort of a minimum load clearing requirement where load, and I forget the exact details, so I'm going to have a sharper memory than I do, had to clear something like 90 or 95% of its forecasted load in the day-ahead market. And then when we introduced virtual bidding, that went away because the whole premise of virtual bidding is that market forces would bring prices to some flavor of equilibrium based on the best market information that was available. So that is something else to consider if there's not convergence bidding or virtual bidding in the other balancing authorities. If there's a secondary requirement for some sort of clearing of a percentage of the forecast, and that gets into the comment that was just made by the ISO about the EDAM being an all load market. I don't think that means 100% of forecast needs to clear all the time because people can have different forecasts. So anyways, a lot of RUC is not an out of market. RUC is a market, and concerns about quantity clearing, those are the two methods to address those we've used in the past, virtual bidding or a minimum of forecast clearing in the market. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, I'm going to move on to, let's go to Paul Wood from Pacific Corp.
Thanks, Mark. Paul Wood at Pacific Corp. And I apologize for dragging on this topic, but I'm just trying to get my head around it. It's not something that we're familiar with, this RUC market, and I'm just trying to understand it. So if someone is passing the RSE advisory run at 9 a.m., I'm assuming that they have their demand forecast as accurate as they possibly can get it. Then at 10 a.m. they submit the final RSE. They have a balanced system for the 24 hours. Assuming there's no convergence bidding, I don't understand why the need then presents itself for RUC to help clear the difference between someone's demand and generation that has already passed the advisory run and the final submission. To me, it's almost like
thank you for the
RUC,
question.
To me, George, it's almost like the RUC meets the convergence bidding that could go on between, physical and the financial markets.
In essence, yes, for load bids. So if we leave the virtual bids out, as you said in your question here, assume that we don't have any virtual supply or demand that clears the IFM, why do we need RUC? And the answer is that load is taking a financial position in the IFM. They could, of course, self-schedule the entire demand forecast, and that's okay. That's part of bidding participation. But they may, and usually what happens is that they take a financial position, which may be, somewhat below the demand forecast. So although the resource efficiency evaluation in EDAM checks for the demand forecast to have enough capacity, and let's say you pass the RSC, so you do have enough capacity. If the load clears the IFM below the demand forecast, you have the capacity available, so RUC performs the next step of taking that capacity that is left over from IFM and procuring reliability capacity now, which is a product, and it has a market clearing price, and it carries a real-time stopper obligation, so that capacity is secured to be participating in the EIM when you need it to cover that gap. So you can pass the RSC, but if that capacity is left unprocured, it may not be available in real time. That's what I said in the previous slide, right? So that's where you need RUC.
Yeah, I guess I'm just struggling back to some of the comments from the Nevada folks in in what idle generation is just sitting by that hasn't been dispatched or nominated into the RSE. That's the part I'm struggling with. If I have a gas unit that I'm not bidding in to the RSE, I can't submit it in the RUC market because I haven't procured gas for the day ahead.
Oh, that's not what we're saying. Yeah, maybe there's a misunderstanding. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that the capacity that you did make available in IFM, you submitted bids for the IFM commodities, energy, ancillary service. Okay, let's leave the ancillary service because we don't optimize them in day one. You can self-provide them though, in balance reserve. So you bid all this capacity into the IFM to get awards and schedules. All we're saying is that if not all of that clears the IFM, since you have committed to make this capacity available in IFM, so you are prepared to get an award on it and have it available in real time, why not bidding it also in RAC? So that if the load takes a financial position below your demand forecast, RAC can procure this out of this capacity, reliability capacity awards to cover the difference, and now you're secure going to real time. That's all we're saying. We're not saying that you have to make capacity available in RAC that you were not intended to make available in IFM. Actually, we don't allow that. We have bidding rules in cyber today that say that if you want to participate in RAC, you must participate first in IFM. Capacity has to go through IFM first. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you for your question, Paul. Let me go to Petter, and then I'm going to ask James to pull up his slides on some of the RUC transfer examples, and I think that will kind of help better illustrate the interplay with RUC, convergence bidding, and in the EDAM construct. So, Petter, go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, sir.
Okay, so first, in all organized markets currently in US, independent of how they procure capacity, they're through separate capacity markets or scarcity pricing or regulated like in our market, RAC and IFM are separate, and that's a standard best practice. What was tried a couple of years ago is something very innovative to integrate RAC and IFM. And what happened then, it was very apparent that capacity prices started to penetrate LMPs of energy, which in markets like CAISO and EDAM in the future and SPP, where procurement is pretty much regulated bilateral, would mean double payment for capacity. And it was tried many ways to separate that, to avoid that, and it couldn't be resolved. And that's why that initiative didn't go that direction. Instead, just new products were added to IFM, and George can correct me, I remember IRU or something like that, influence reserve up and down. And that fact doesn't change if you have just CAL ISO or multiple other EDAM entities, as Jeff said, that because of that we need to reopen that discussion. The same cons are still valid. Now, there is a discussion about what are the accurate prices and is RAC producing accurate prices, and there is a debate in industry between net producer and net consumers, and net users obviously want to increase the prices to get additional capacity payments. That's important for markets like in the East, where you have separate capacity market and people are having problem missing money. Usually that problem is not existing in a market like ours to justify changes like that. And to follow up on Jeff Nelson, the RAC is not auto market, it is market, because you're optimizing, you have bids. And in following up on what George said on this display, George, I believe that what you pass RSC with, you have to keep those bids minimum all the way through all passes, including RAC. Otherwise, you may be leaning by not bidding in the RAC everything that you used to pass RSC. And that will be a precondition for economic exchange of capacity in RAC, because then you know that nobody is leaning, everybody came in completely satisfied after RSC. Of course, they can bid more if they want to, but I think that's the must, that whatever you pass with RSC, that is the minimum must offer to all passes, IFM, MPM, 2 RACs, whatever. because it doesn't make any sense to pass RSC with something and you don't show up that later. That will be leaning by definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And that's exactly the statement made here in the last bullet of this slide. Make all capacity bid in IFM available to RAC with reliability capacity bids. That's exactly the intent. But thank you.
I'm just saying this has to be must. It can be like it looks optional here, is not hard enough. So that really has to be must requirement. You're too nice, in other words, in this statement here.
I am nice. I concede that. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for your comments. All right, James. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through your RUC transfer examples.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. I was asked to put together these examples to demonstrate why it is important for the day-ahead market to solve to maintain the ability to use RUC transfers, which is essentially trading of economic trading of capacity within the RUC market between EDAM participants. And we will hopefully in this slide also sort of demonstrate some of the foundational workings of RUC so it can potentially address some of the other more fundamental questions that were asked in the last several minutes. So let's go to the first slide. Okay, so to set up the examples, we're going to be considering two BAAs, both EDAM participants. This is going to be a single interval example, okay, so we're going to be talking about a solution only over 1 hourly interval. And so what this slide demonstrates essentially, since there's no time element of this for the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation, we're only considering the capacity test on this slide. But the BAA on the left has supply capacity of 4,000 megawatts, a demand forecast of 3,000 megawatts, an upward ancillary service requirement of 150 megawatts, and an upward uncertainty requirement of 300 megawatts. So if you add up the demand forecast, the ancillary services, and the upward uncertainty, that is within the supply capacity that was offered, and so they pass the upward capacity test. The BAA on the right has the same amount of supply capacity. They're a little tighter. They have a demand forecast of 3,500 megawatts and upward AS of 150 and upward uncertainty of 300. So if you add those three values up, it sums to 3,950, and so they also pass the upward capacity test, although they have a little less surplus than BA1, and we'll see how that becomes relevant in the next slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so both of these BAs have demonstrated that they have sufficient capacity to pass the upward capacity test. Now we're going to move into IFM, and what we're going to assume is that all physical supply is bid into the IFM for energy. But what's going to happen here is that the BA on the left, BA1, is going to self-schedule their load at 100 megawatts lower than their demand forecast, okay? So they're going to provide a self-scheduled load bid of 2,900 megawatts. And the BA on the right, in the upper right corner, is going to provide a self-scheduled load bid of 3,500, which is equal to their forecast, okay? So this just demonstrates that when it comes to the IFM, that load is participating through bids, and it is not obligated necessarily to bid their load in a way that exactly matches their demand forecast. They are using the IFM to establish a financial position for themselves in the day-ahead market. Okay, so then we move down to the second level, and the second level shows the IFM results. What happens is, in this case, we're assuming that in BA1, that they have resources that are economic to enough that they are providing transfers of both energy and imbalance reserves to BA2. And so in terms of the IFM schedules, their energy is going to clear at 3,400, which is 2,900 of their own load, and then 500 additional megawatts of energy that its suppliers are using to support transfers to BA2. We will, in all these examples, we'll assume that the upward AS is all fixed. But in the imbalance reserves, same thing. We assume that based on the economics of the bids, that it is optimal for BA1 to provide 100 megawatts of transfers for imbalance reserves to BA2. And so coming out of IFM, BA1 has a 400 megawatt imbalance reserve awards, which is the 300 coming from their own requirement, plus the 100 that they're transferring to BA2. And then on the other hand, on the other side, BA1 or BA2 only has a 3,000 megawatt energy schedule, which is its self-scheduled demand minus the transfers it's receiving from BA1, and then imbalance reserves of 200, which is its own 300 megawatt imbalance reserve requirement minus the 100 that they're receiving from BA1. Okay, so just to summarize again, what we're seeing in this example is BA1 underbidding their demand forecast by 100 megawatts in the IFM, and it's supporting 600 megawatts of total transfers, 500 for energy and 100 for imbalance reserves from BA1 to BA2. Okay, let's move to the next slide.
Hold on one second, James, if you don't mind going back. I want to make sure that the audience is following this example. Are there any questions or clarifications needed on this before this builds on the next slide? I see Anu with his hand up. Operator, if you want to mind. Thank you. Go ahead, Anu.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Anu from LADWP. I just wanted to make sure the physical supply bids that have been referred to, are those all resource specific? Is any portion of that coming from intertie bidding, or can you please comment on that?
Yeah, I'm assuming that all of these physical supply bids are all from resources that this BA has shown in their resource sufficiency evaluation. So whether that's through their own internal resources or from, prearranged bilateral transfers coming through other bucket one transfers.
All resource specific unless they are WSPP firm, right, or bilateral contract firm. Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
All right, let's go to Paul Wood from Pacific Corp before moving on. We got another hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Paul Wood, Pacific Corp. If BA1 underbids their demand by 100 megs, how do they pass the RSC final?
The RSC final, are you talking about RUC, or are you talking about the RSC, the real-time resource efficiency evaluation?
So I think what, if I'm reading the slide right, the load underbids, but the supply has more than enough, which is why it results in a transfer to BA2. So the supply bid in is what is getting used to pass the RSC. And feel free to correct me if I'm incorrect, James or George.
Yes, and also the target is not load schedule, it's the demand forecast. So it doesn't matter that the load underbids, to use the same words that James has in his example. If it doesn't matter, we test it to meet.
Yeah, but if I'm BA1 and I pass my final RSE, how do I underbid my load?
Okay, let's rewind. So in the RSC, we test whether the BAA has sufficient supply to meet the demand forecast and uncertainty. And let's say they pass the RSC because they do have all that supply available. And then in the market, we clear supply bids and load bids. And load bids could come and clear at below the demand forecast. So that's a perfectly acceptable outcome. So you can pass the RSC, which means you have sufficient capacity to meet the demand forecast and the uncertainty, and then IFM can clear below the demand forecast, and this is exactly why you need RAC to cover the difference. Like we go back to previous slides, that's one of the reasons and the advantages that RAC provides. That if your IFM clears below the demand forecast, RAC will make up the difference in reliability capacity. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I'm just gonna have to think about that more. Because to me, it seems like you could game the system by doing that. You underbid your load. It's like Dan was saying.
Mm-hmm.
You consistently underbid your load because it's like you can't meet it. It's August 17th on 21, and you just underbid it.
Well, here we assume that you passed the RSC test based on what you said. So you do meet the requirements in the resource efficiency evaluation, but what financial position you will take in the IFM, it's a completely different issue. Now, if you have specific scenarios that you're thinking that you may be concerned about gaming or market manipulation, you're all welcome to send them to us, and we'll analyze them and provide an answer.
Okay. Thanks, George.
All right. Thanks, George. Thanks, Paul. All right, James, go ahead.
Okay, so we've moved on from IFM and now we're into RUC. By the way, IFM, when you're bidding into the day-ahead market, you're providing bids for the IFM and the RUC at the same time. So all of these bids that are relevant to IFM and the RUC are submitted by 10 a.m. at the close of the day-ahead market. Okay, so let's look at where we are at with BA1 and BA2 in terms of RUC. So BA1 and BA2 both continue to have total supply capacity of 4,000 megawatts. And this kind of goes back to George and Petter's conversation that at least in these examples, we're assuming that all of the supply capacity used to meet resource efficiency evaluation are providing bids for RUC. Okay, so we're going to assume that it's all available for RUC. Now on the upper left-hand side, those are the three schedules from IFM for BA1. And the sum of those three schedules are 3950, which means that if they have 3,950 megawatts of, I guess we'll call demand schedules in, or demand plus ancillary service plus imbalance reserve schedules from IFM, and they have 4,000 megawatts of total supply, then going into RUC, they have a total available RUC capacity of 50 megawatts. And then in BA2, who has received transfers from BA1, they have a much higher capacity available to them in RUC in their BA because remember they received 600 megawatts worth of combined energy and imbalance reserve transfers. So when you have transfers enabled, what happens in this scenario is that RUC goes back to using the demand forecast to clear the RUC solution. So you'll see in the bottom ovals that for both BA1 and BA2, the demand forecast is again the relevant target for RUC. And then on the left-hand side for BA1, we can see the RUC procurement target by showing what's the demand forecast minus the cleared bid and load. And so remember from the previous slide that this BA had underbid 100 megawatts of their bid and load. And so they have a RUC target of 100 megawatts that they need to support having enough physical capacity to meet their forecast. But they only have, as in the oval above, it shows they only have internal to their VA or accessible to them through resource efficiency. They only have 50 megawatts of RUC capacity. Now, on the right-hand side, the BA2 has plenty of additional supply or additional RUC capacity that it can use to support a transfer of RUC capacity from BA2 to BA1. And they don't have any RUC needs themselves because they bid in equal to their forecast. And so their RUC target is 0. And so by enabling RUC transfers, the optimal solution would be that BA2 would send BA1 50 megawatts worth of reliability capacity transfers, and then the remaining 50 megawatts of RUC capacity in BA1 would also get scheduled for RUC. So just to review, in this case, when transfers are enabled, what would happen is that a 50 megawatt reliability capacity transfer from BA2 to BA1 would ensure there's sufficient supply in BA1 to meet its demand obligations.
All right, I'm gonna pause you there, James. Thanks for walking through that. I see Jeff Nelson with his hand up. Go ahead, Jeff.
Good afternoon again, Jeff Nelson, SE. Okay, so under the scenario, we've got, I guess, 50 megawatts transferring. Well, it's RUC capacity, right? So you're kind of reserving 50 megawatts of transmission transfer capability from BA2 to BA1. Is that correct?
It's not necessarily reserving, well, from the RUC capacity it is, but the transmission that is available in RUC to support transfers is that which is left over, either left over from IFM or is counterflowing on IFM transfers that were scheduled.
Or hurdle rates up to like bucket 3 or something. So maybe that's left over. Okay, so let's assume that there was some unused leftover bucket 1, bucket 2 transmission to get the 50 megawatts from BA2 to BA1. How long is that 50 megawatts, quote unquote, preserved? I mean, what if come real time someone wheels through BA1 on that line to BA0?
Yeah, to me that is a question of, you know, the relevant scheduling priorities of all of these transactions as we get into real time, and I'm not sure I have an answer at this point.
Maybe I can help. Hi, Jeff.
George.
This is George Angelidis. Yeah, so first of all, we don't even have to make the assumption that there is 50 megawatt of available transmission capacity on the transfer, because we know that there is already 600 megawatt being used from from 1 to 2 in the day-ahead market. So this is simply a counterflow. So the capacity exists. So this counterflow allows essentially to meet the requirements in BA1 from surplus in BA2. Now, how long it's reserved? Actually, you don't need to do anything to reserve it explicitly, because we don't run any market between day-ahead and real time. This is your day-ahead market results. This transmission capacity was available, RUC used it, and now going into real time, okay, the first market you're going to run for this, let's say it's HASP, right? You now have the demand forecast in both BAAs. You don't have load schedules anymore. So this capacity is already available. HASP will use it, will reoptimize it, right? And maybe you will have a 50 megawatt of energy counterflow on the day-ahead schedules based on this solution, or you may have even something more efficient that the real-time market may find. It may find new bids in BAA1 to meet the demand forecast of BAA1, and then you won't have that transfer in real time. So the problem is reoptimized in the EIM, but at least you go with the security that if you need this 50 megawatts, the day-ahead market has already procured it. Procured reliability capacity of 50 megawatts in BA2, ready to be called on through the available transmission capacity of 50 megawatts on the transfers to meet the demand forecast for BA1. But the real-time market will actually optimize this and may find better solutions.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Thanks. And just, I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure. So BAA1 gets a bill for 50 megawatts of the RUC capacity in this case.
Okay, now we're going we're going into the cost allocation of RUC, so that's a little bit more complex. You don't get a direct bill. There is a reliability capacity cost allocation, okay, and the cost allocation is performed at the BA level, but there is an accommodation for transfer. So if you're a net export BAA, some of that cost is going to be exported. And if you are a net import BAA, you will import some of that cost from exporting BAA. So there is sort of like a bill, but it's not explicit. It's implicit in the way the RUC cost allocation takes place, right, through the neutrality and those transfers.
Okay, you completely lost me. So if we're just in a world where this is the only RUC that happens, does BAA1 get the bill for 50 megawatts?
Yes, but not directly. All right, it's more complicated. They're not going to get a bill for 50 megawatts of reliability capacity. What happens is that we'll calculate the cost for procuring that reliability capacity, and there is a cost for the 50 megawatts in BA1. There is a cost for the 50 megawatts procurement in BA2, right? And then that cost is allocated, and part of that allocation will take into consideration the fact that BA2 is exporting to BA1. But it's not a simple saying that they're going to get a bill for 50 megawatts. It has to go through the RUC cost allocation. And if you want the details, I believe James is on the line. He can elaborate a little bit on that if it is important to cover it on this example.
No, I think I'll pause on that because cost allocation is sort of a tail. Let's make sure we get the dog understood. Thanks.
Very good.
All right. Thank you, Jeff and George. All right, James, go ahead.
Sure, next slide, please. Okay, so now we are in a situation where if we had either put into the RUC design in EDAM that we would not allow transfers, or for some reason, I know in the simple example that like George explained, the 50 megawatts of reliability capacity from the previous example counterflows on the 600 that was coming from BA1 to BA2 and IFM. But just imagine a world where reliability capacity transfers weren't enabled. Then essentially what would happen here is that BA1, because of the way the ISM solution worked, and presumably in this case, it overall had cheaper resources to schedule and dispatch in the IFM, that the leftover RUC capacity that's available internal to BA1 would be insufficient to meet the power balance constraint in RUC without access to transfers. So you can see that they need 100 megawatts. That's their RUC target. But internal to their BA, they're only left with 50 megawatts of supply. And then without access to the transfer from BA2, they're not able to pass the RUC, or they're not able to solve the RUC power balance constraint, which puts them in a scarcity situation. Next slide, please. So almost the exact same logic can be applied from the previous example to this example, where instead of a load underbidding their demand forecast, in this case, we are clearing virtual supply in the IFM. So in BA1, not only are there 4,000 megawatts worth of physical supply bids, there's also a 100 megawatt virtual supply, let's just say net virtual supply bid in BA1. And then, whoops, on the upper right-hand corner should say BA2, but BA2, we're assuming that there's no, either no virtual bids or that the virtual demand and the virtual supply perfectly net each other out. So by having this, when the IFM runs, and we'll assume that the virtual supply bid is economic in this case and gets awarded. So on the lower level, you can see that the BA1, its resources receive exactly the same schedules and exactly the same quantities of transfers as was optimal for the previous example. Just in this case that the 100 megawatts of virtual supply supports, extra additional transfers to BA2. So next slide, please. And then again, when we move into RUC, RUC is negating the net virtuals from the IFM. And so you can see in the upper left that I've added the word IFM physical energy schedule to represent the fact that in RUC, all that is relevant is the quantity of physical resources that are scheduled and not the virtual supply that was scheduled. And so the quantity of RUC capacity for each BA is exactly the same. There's 50 megawatts of additional capacity for BA1 to use for their RUC and 650 megawatts for BA2. And then moving down to the next level, how RUC would clear, it's again referencing the demand forecast as part of the RUC clearing process. BA1 has, because we've included this concept of virtuals, the way you would calculate their RUC procurement target is by taking their demand forecast minus their cleared bid and load, which at this point there's zero difference, plus the net virtual supply, which is 100 megawatts. So the RUC target for BA1 is 100 megawatts. But they only have, within their BA, they only have 50 megawatts of RUC supply available to them. And so what would happen is, in this case, when transfers are enabled, that BA2 would provide a 50 megawatt reliability capacity transfer to BA1. And then last slide, please. And so again, the exact same logic applies that in this case, to the extent that RUC transfers weren't enabled, the net virtual supply from IFM allows BA1 to support physical transfers and leaves them with a supply available to RUC that's insufficient to pass their power balance or to solve their power balance constraint without the additional 50 megawatts of transfers. And that's all I have. So let me know, Mark, if there are any other questions.
Thank you, James. All right, so let me turn to the audience, see if anyone had any questions, comments, or clarifications based on the examples that James just laid out.
I also, Mark, if I could, I want to add one more bit of flavor to the first example, and it maybe it helps with Paul's questions from the beginning, but we could imagine that. So in the example that I put together, we had all of the load bidding is self-schedules, right? So in that first example, the load is self-scheduling 100 megawatts less than their demand forecast. But what's missing from these examples are prices. And what could also happen is that, let's say that the marginal clearing price for energy in this example for IFM is $50. We could also imagine that in that first example that instead of just self-scheduling 2,900, they self-schedule 2,900 and then also submit an economic bid for an economic demand bid for $100. And so in that case, that BA is demonstrating that I'll buy the additional, that I will buy the additional demand no more than, or I'm willing to pay up to $100 for that demand. And so in that case, if the price was $50, then their economic demand bid would clear. But if the marginal clearing price for the day-ahead market was $150, then their economic demand bid doesn't clear. And so from that perspective, they're still, in a sense, bidding the quantity from their demand forecast. It's just part of it they're self-scheduling, and then part of it they are providing as economic demand bids, which I think is pretty consistent with the way that CAISO participants, load participants today participate through a mix of self-schedules and economic demand bids.
That's helpful, James. Thanks for that additional color and context in that example. So thank you, James and George, for walking us through your slides. At this point, I want to pose the question I mentioned earlier that I would really appreciate feedback on from the audience. And that's whether or not parties share the same view generally as the ISO in regards to agreeing that conceptually EDAM should have some form of RUC and/or convergence bidding included in its design. So let me pause there, and Southwest entities, Northwest entities, California PTOs, IOUs, I would appreciate everyone to weigh in on this, please. I see Tong from WAPA.
This is Tong Wu from WAPA. I have a question about the relationship between the ROC capacity, imbalance reserve capacity, and the real-time EIM flexible ramping and balancing requirement. So when you have a transfer from one BA to the other BA, the receiving BA through some allocation mechanism would pay for that ROC capacity. Does that mean in real time, BAA1 in this case, if this BA receives some reliability capacity up, and BAA1 is paying for that, would that reduce the balancing requirement? If BAA1, or in your example, BAA2 was receiving imbalancing requirement from BAA1, would that reduce BAA2's flexible ramping requirement? Are you hearing me?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Tom,
yeah.
We heard you. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. So your question is how these products were related. I think this is the first thing that I heard you asking. So imbalance reserve and reliability capacity, different products, they don't overlap with each other. They're procured differently. They have different prices, different settlement. Okay. Now, flexible ramp product, okay, it does have a relationship with the imbalance reserve product. Essentially, imbalance reserve can be made available in real time to actually use that capacity to procure flexible ramp from it. And of course, dispatch it as energy or whatever. It's, you're reoptimizing that in real time. It's simply be made available as capacity with an energy bid in real time to be reoptimized. Now, what we have said in the past is because of the granularity difference of these two products, balance reserve being 15 minutes in day ahead and flexible ramping a 5-minute product in real time, there's a limit to how much imbalance reserve can be converted to flexible ramp. And that limit is the 5-minute ramp capability portion of the imbalance reserve award. And for that portion, you have a deviation settlement in real time. For the remaining portion, in excess of that, you just wanted to have it available in real time, and it will be used either as energy or something else. You could even procure spin from it. But then on that portion, you have a no pay that applies. So if it's not available because of some outage, then you get no pay for that. For the bottom portion, which is the conversion, the potential conversion to flexible ramp, you get a deviation settlement. So that's how we sliced it. Is this answers your question?
Yeah, kind of. Let me put it in a different perspective. Let's say I'm a BA, and if I'm not a part of the EDAM, what I need to do is I need to come up with the hourly resources to balance my portfolio in real time. And also, I need to come up with the flexible ramping capacity bidding to the ISO so to meet my requirement. And I need to do that if I'm not part of the EDAM. So
I assume you're part of EIM, though, right?
Yeah, assuming I'm part of EIM, of course, right? So when I'm part of EIM, what I need to do, I need to balance my portfolio. I need to come up with flexible ramping in real time. And now, if I participate in EDAM, and I'm paying for imbalance reserve, I'm paying for rock capacity. Naturally, I would hope that that payment would translate into some benefit that would reduce my burden of balancing my requirement or
absolutely
right. I would expect that, especially if the generators and load are not the same company, right? And while the generator is getting paid and load I'm paying, I could just pay the generator to help me to meet my balancing requirement and the flexible ramping directly, bilaterally. I can sign a contract, they would do that for me. But now, by participating in EDAM, the generators will get paid from the ISO. And as a load, I'm going to get charged. I'm not saying I represent load, but let's say, load would get charged. But after all, if I'm not getting any benefit out of this, I still need to come up with the balancing requirement and flexible ramping requirement as usual. Then I'm just paying twice.
Yeah.
Right? So can you help me to analyze this, figure out what benefit do I have to participate in EDAM?
Yes. So this is what we showed in one of my slides at the end before the examples. That basically what I said was that one of the benefits that RAC provides as an EDAM entity is that it procures reliability capacity to cover your demand forecast, and if your load schedule clears below that in IFM, and also substitute for any net virtual supply that is scheduled in IFM, substitute with physical capacity, and it commits units if necessary to have that capacity awarded and secured in day-ahead market, so that going into real time, now you have that capacity available with a bid because of the real-time Astopher obligation for it. So now, if, say for changes in system conditions, if there is an outage on a resource, for example, say for that, you're essentially almost guaranteed to pass the real-time sufficiency test because now you have everything lined up from the day ahead. And that's one of the benefits of EDAM participation towards EIM participation. You're already done the job in day-ahead market of securing the capacity to meet your requirements in EIM.
So is the ISO keeping track of this? Let's say I'm BAA1 and I don't have enough generation capacity, but through ROC, BAA2 is providing rock through ISO's rock process, but I don't have a contract with the BAA2. I don't know which resource it is meeting my need to balance my portfolio. Would ISO automatically provide that balancing, or do I still have to explicitly show which resource is balancing my load in real time? Which resource is providing the flexible ramping? Would ISO automatically give me credit because of the day-ahead process?
Yes, Tom, it wouldn't be fair if the market operator would not track this. I mean, this is part of the job of running the market. And yes, if you have these transfers arranged in the day ahead, and then what we said, and we haven't spent too much time saying how all of these EDAM results translate to EIM. We said bits and pieces, and this is one of the items that we'll have to cover a little bit more in detail in future calls. But essentially, everything that clears the day-ahead market becomes something similar to base schedules in EIM. So essentially, it becomes a starting position for the EIM. And obviously, because the day-ahead schedules are balanced with all the transfers and all the capacity is meeting the day-ahead requirements, and we'll have to track that. So when we perform the real-time, the EIM resource sufficiency evaluation, of course, we can give full credit for everything that is already arranged and paid for in the day-ahead market. That goes with no say.
Okay, all right. Just we're not discussing that yet. It sounds like rock capacity can be used towards meeting the balancing requirement, and imbalance reserve capacity can be used to some extent, maybe partially, for the flexible ramping requirement.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Let me go to Bonnie Blair with the 6 cities.
Bonnie Blair, representing the 6 cities. I have a question about virtual bidding. We've talked about a lot about how RUC might work in EDAM. I think less extensively about how virtual bidding would work in EDAM. But there was a comment, I think it was at the last meeting, that the CAISO was thinking about allowing EDAM participants to allow or not allow virtual bidding on a BAA by BAA basis. And I'm having trouble figuring out how that would work. And in particular, would a virtual bid in one BAA be able to set the marginal market clearing price for the entire EDAM footprint, including BAAs that didn't allow virtual bidding?
All right. Is there anyone from the ISO team that would like to opine on that? I see Danny Johnson with his hand up.
Thanks, Mark. So, Bonnie, I think what you're getting at is potential asymmetries that could arise if convergence bidding is allowed or allowed at different levels between one EDAM BAA and another EDAM BAA. I think this is something we're aware of and we've started to think through, but I think through this presentation, we're just trying to socialize and provide background on what the purpose of convergence bidding is, and then to see what the appetite for allowing it within the EDAM footprint would be before we have to start thinking through designing around all of the implications of asymmetric convergence bidding application.
Okay. I mean, on one level that makes sense. On another level, I'm sort of thinking, well, what I think about virtual bidding in EDAM depends a lot on whether there are going to be asymmetries, and if so, how those asymmetries are going to impact my clients. And I get why you wouldn't want to wrestle with that challenge if if nobody else would be interested in virtual bidding in EDAM, but I sort of feel like I don't see how folks can answer the question that you've asked, which is what's your appetite for virtual bidding without knowing how it would work.
Bonnie, to answer your second question. Oh, I'm sorry, Danny, go ahead.
No, George, you're making a point.
Yeah, so you had a question whether a virtual bid, let's say in the ISO BAA, can set the marginal price for energy across the system, across the market footprint, assuming, of course, transfers are not binding, so that you have one marginal price. And the answer is yes. I want to make sure that we have a clear answer on this question. And what we have said earlier several times is that the IFM actually does not distinguish between virtual bids and physical bids. So it treats them exactly the same, full symmetry. It uses them the same way for meeting load bids and for congestion management, and so they're essentially treated identical to physical bids. Okay.
So me, it raises a question of if let's say, half the BAAs that participate in EDAM allow virtual bidding and half the BAAs don't. Are there, Danny's used the word asymmetries. Are there asymmetries that result from that, and what are the implications of those asymmetries? And I would want to know more about that. Let's put it that way.
Sure. I think this example here that you see on the screen gives you one of the answers that because of the presence of virtual bids in at least one BAA, you need rack and rack transfers available to cover the situation where IFM may schedule transfers which could actually be supported by virtual supply. And then if you let that solution go into real time, that virtual supply is not there. So how can the BAA that has now a commitment to provide that export out of virtual supply can meet that commitment? And the answer comes here, as shown in this example. RAC gives the answer and RAC transfers give the answer. So essentially, RAC, as we said, one of the things it does, it replaces virtual supply with physical supply. And in this particular case, it uses physical supply in another BAA to replace the virtual supply of BAA1, and it achieves that through a RAC transfer that counterflows on the IFM transfer that was scheduled because of that net virtual supply. So these are all elements and components of the EDAM that come all together here. So you have to see the IFM and RAC work in unison. And that's why we say you need both parts in EDAM. You can't just do IFM and ignore RAC. You need RAC to provide a complete solution.
Well, what the example says to me is that if you are going to have virtual bidding, then you need RUC. That's clear. But I don't think I think you can have RUC without virtual bidding, and maybe would want to have RUC without virtual bidding, but it isn't obvious to me that that you need virtual bidding, especially if some BAAs are going to be using, recognizing virtual bids and others are not.
I think that's.
I'm not saying that I necessarily have concluded that would be a horrible idea. but I guess I'm not prepared to just accept on, on the basis of what I know now that it would be a good idea.
So I appreciate that.
I think we can agree at a minimum it's a much more complicated idea that we'd have to account for all of those different interactions. And so through this, we're just trying to put out what the concepts behind convergence bidding are. I think the ISO uses this for a reason, and I think the happy path is that all participants would be also interested in using and utilizing this functionality. So the first step in doing that is providing background on what it's used for, and then I think we'll go from there once potential EDAM participants have had a chance to kind of digest this functionality and how it's used.
Thanks, Danny. All right, let me go to Bobby Olson. And just to note, I believe this is going to be one of the questions that I alluded to earlier that will be getting posed to the working group. So to the extent parties need more time to digest this information, to opine on whether or not they feel RUC is necessary to be included in the EDAM design or virtual bidding, you will definitely have that time to kind of sit there and think about it. So what we're kind of looking for today is just a general level of understanding and yes, it makes sense to include, but we need more details. So Bobby, let me go to you. Let me go to Bobby Olson and hear his thoughts. And just for a time check, we have about 5-6 minutes. So I'd appreciate if everyone kept it brief because I'm going to try to run through the stack of hands here. Go ahead, Bobby.
Yep, I'll try and keep it brief. This is Bobby Olson with SRP. Appreciate taking the time to call on me. I think as we look at this, to the extent that there's uncertainty for EDAM that goes into RUC, if that's the location that the uncertainty gets bid into there, then I think RUC makes some sense from that context. We're still not there with respect to virtual bidding. I think there's two questions: what's the need for it, and what's the need for it on day one for EDAM? But I think the challenge that several of us are wrestling with, or at least SRP is wrestling with, is kind of the proposal to do RUC, virtual bids, all of this. It really has us all operating pretty darn close to what ISOs do, and it's trying to think through pushing the limits of what BAs can do without consolidating BAs. I think is really what this is getting at, and that's trying to maximize the benefits of EDAM, and I appreciate that, but I think that maybe the lack of a bunch of raised hands and dialogue, as you're calling out there, has been more of a trying to understand what it means to go to this level without consolidating the BA.
I appreciate that, Bobby. Thank you for your comments, and I've made a note of that, and I'll work with the ISO team to see what we can bring to clear things up. Let me go to Stuart Kelly in LA. And Stuart, if you don't mind, quickly addressing those two questions I posed, and then I'll continue down the stack.
Very brief. In summary, I understand the need for RUC. Similar to Bobby, the whole virtual bidding needs a far deeper dive. It may ultimately, is it day one? Is it not day one? What's the implication of not being day one? Because it may ultimately be needed. But then if it's even implemented, we potentially need some kind of guardrails or whatever, because if you have a smaller number of entities joining, or you have some with virtual bidding, some without, I can see a bunch of seams issues that could drive prices that really concern me. So virtual bidding needs a far deeper dive, and it needs to be considered how that's implemented regardless. And then just real briefly, are we, George, are you contemplating we're going to continue to run, if you're an EDAM participant, we're going to still have the same construct, that we're going to have the BA operator balancing at T40 and still do the real-time RSE test? We haven't really had that discussion. I don't know if it's maybe teed up for a future time, or if we're running out of time, but I just wonder if there's an opportunity to modify what I think is particularly burdensome. I recognize it needs to be updated, load forecasts are changing, but Is your expectation at the moment the same construct stands in real time, even if you're EDAM participant?
Yes,
so
this is George. So we don't have, we don't have in the scope of either DAME or EDAM to actually make redesigns or material changes to the resource efficiency evaluation that is performed in the Western energy imbalance market, other than the current initiative where we have some improvements for that resource efficiency evaluation. Of course, we'll have to make some changes to the inputs. Like as I mentioned to Tong, we have new information now for EDAM BAAs coming into EIM from the EDAM solution, and we have to realize that there were some commitments made in EDAM in terms of transfers that now, of course, we have to take that into consideration and provide the appropriate credits in the EIM RSE to connect the dots. So that's the minimum that we for sure have to make some changes there, right?
No, that's fair enough, George. But just generally, if at some point, if we could get operators more focused on the system instead of that nebulous approach and allow us to take care of it. But in the interest of time, I'll shut up.
Thank you, Stuart. And just so you're aware, we do have later on some time allotted to discuss, results of EDAM and how that interplays in real time. I saw Kathy Anderson's hand up from Idaho. Kathy, did you care to weigh in on RUC and/or virtual bidding prior to concluding today's call?
Yeah, sorry. You know what? I'm good. Everyone kind of said what I said. What I was thinking. I need more time to really think about this. I can't say much more than that. It's kind of I'm still looking at this.
Okay, so kind of consistent with Bobby and Stuart then is RUC makes sense, but definitely a lot deeper dive on virtual bidding and why the need.
And the ties, yep, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Doug.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I just had two comments. It seems that as long as there is any EDAM BAA, including ISO, that allows virtual bidding, or as long as the IFM is cleared based on bid and demand rather than the forecast, you have to have some kind of RUC process. We can't avoid having a RUC if either of those two things is in place. And my other comment is, CAISO had an issue with intertie virtual bidding way back when, and I think remains, not allowed. And it seems to me that if we have adjacent EDAM BAAs that allow virtual bidding, even if intertie virtual bidding isn't allowed, might we have similar problems that cropped up when intertie virtual bidding was allowed in CAISO? Just something I think worth investigating.
Thank you, Doug. All right, so I see Dan's hand, and Jan, I will come to you on the next meeting. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Cott for a quick summary, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about what we'll cover next. Go ahead, Bob.
All right, Mark, can you hear me?
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, we start off the meeting with the continued discussion of the RUC design discussion, George presenting slides discussing why we need RUC. And then we had some questions, comments regarding that presentation. And IFM secures all market products as preferred over an inclusion of RUC and EDAM. Question of whether demand forecast is used in RUC. Answer was the same as is used in the RFC. Question about how RUC capacity is declared. And the answer was through the bid submitted and the RUC clearing process. And then a comment about the RUC is a market for capacity. separate and distinct from the IFM, and other comment about that this being the best practice to have RUC and IFM separate, and also another comment regarding that bids into RUC must include all capacity that's bid into the IFM and considered in the RSE. We moved on to RUC transfer examples presented by James, description of BAA1 and BAA2 meeting the RSE, and then various examples about using RUC transfers or not using transfers and how that might create shortage or scarcity conditions. Also, other examples, including virtual bids. Questions and comments regarding that discussion. Supply bid resources, are they specific? And the answer was the resources that are shown in the RSE. Questions regarding RUC clearing at a different amount than the demand forecast, and concerns about gaming with that paradigm. And we suggested maybe that entity can provide some example of the concerns so we can consider those. Questions about how transmission is used, and then some questions about how transfers are paid for, and that is through the cost allocation process, which we didn't want to dive into any further. And then we considered the question that you posed at the beginning about whether entities believe we should include RUC and convergence bidding in EDAM. Didn't hear any clear answers, more questions about how the products work, and perhaps we need more time to consider this question. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that, and apologies for not leaving you much time again. Christina, if you wouldn't mind going to the failure consequences slide. I think it's slide 6, and I just want to leave the meeting, this one right here, thank you, with something for everyone to think about. So as I mentioned, we will pose some questions. We'll get those posted. We'll send out a communication to everybody that's registered for Working Group 1, on what your thoughts are on RUC and a few other items. So we really appreciate your guys' feedback there. To the extent there's time, we will bring those back up in this forum for a more group discussion. But next, I'd like to kind of dive in a little further into some of these failure consequences. We haven't heard much feedback or, ideas around different concepts and framework options out there. Danny from the ISO did propose the hurdle rate option. So we'll definitely talk about that a little bit more. But I wanted to pose some questions here to get the parties thinking about, some of the items to consider around failure consequences. And, to the extent there's an idea out there floating around a conceptual framework that pertains to financial ramifications for not passing the RSE, please reach out to me and let me know, and let's get into that discussion. With that, have a great rest of your afternoon. Apologies for going over, and we'll talk to everybody on Monday. Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.